The Dakota wind has a voice if you listen long enough. It doesn't speak in words, but in whispers that comb through the prairie grass and moan around the corners of a lonely sod house. For Maeve Callahan, a widow clinging to the acre of land her husband had bled for, that voice was her only companion, until the day it brought her something else. Not a whisper, but a cry, a sound the land itself tried to swallow. This isn't a story of heroes in white hats or villains in black. It's a true account from the blood-soaked soil of 1877 of how a single act of mercy could put a woman in the path of a storm, and how the dawn after a kindness could rise on a doorframe filled with war paint. The sun of late August 1877 was a merciless hammer over the Dakota Territory, beating the resilience out of the land and the hope out of the people who worked it. For Maeve Callahan, it was just another day of survival. Her world had shrunk to the size of her small homestead. A sturdy sod house, a hand-dug well, a meager vegetable patch, and the barn that housed her only true wealth, a milk cow named Daisy, and a stubborn mule called Jedediah. Her husband Sean, a man with a poet's heart and a farmer's hands, was 2 years gone, taken by the same cholera that had swept through their wagon train. He'd left her with this plot of land, a colt peacemaker she knew how to use, and a silence that was heavier than any stone. She was drawing water from the well, the rhythmic creak of the rope, a familiar song when she heard it. It wasn't the yip of a coyote or the call of a hawk. It was a human sound, a pained grunt swallowed almost immediately by the rustle of the cottonwoods down by the creek. Maeve froze her hand tight on the bucket handle. Her heart, a slow and steady drum, began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Company was rare and rarely welcome without notice. A traveler would have hailed the house from a distance. A neighbor, the nearest being the Peterson family 5 miles east, would have come by wagon. This was a sound of stealth and injury. Her first thought was of the renegades the papers in Deadwood sometimes wrote about, men cast out from their tribes or gangs, preying on isolated homesteads. Sean's voice echoed in her memory, calm and firm. Fear is a locked door, Maeve. Prudence is knowing when to bar it. She left the bucket, wiped her damp hands on her worn calico dress, and slipped back inside the sod house. The interior was cool and dark. Her eyes went straight to the pegs by the door, where the Winchester rifle hung, but she reached for the Colt instead. It was faster. She checked the cylinder fully loaded and tucked it into the waistband of her apron. She moved to the window, a small square of glass that looked out toward the creek. She saw nothing but the shimmering heat and the gentle sway of the trees. Prudence told her to bar the door and wait. Wait for the sound to fade, for whoever it was to move on or die. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But Maeve Callahan was the daughter of a country doctor from County Cork, a man who believed a life was a life, no matter the skin it came in or the language it spoke. That part of her, the part that hadn't been hardened by the prairie, warred with the survivor she'd become. After 10 minutes of agonizing silence, her conscience won. She told herself she was just going to look, just to know. She moved with a caution born of solitude, her moccasins a gift from a friendly trader long ago, making no sound on the dry earth. She didn't take the direct path, but followed the shallow ravine that ran behind the barn, using the low brush for cover. The air grew thick and still near the creek, the buzzing of insects loud in her ears. She found him 20 yards from the water, collapsed at the base of a large cottonwood. He was Lakota. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the long black hair matted with sweat and dirt, or the leather breeches he wore. He was lying on his stomach, his face turned away from her, one arm flung out as if reaching for something. And protruding from the muscled expanse of his back, just below the shoulder blade, was the feathered shaft of an arrow. Maeve's breath hitched. Her hand instinctively went to the Colt at her waist. This was the face of the fear that haunted every settler's dream. The stories told in hushed tones in town of Custer's fall at the Little Bighorn just the year before were fresh wounds. The Lakota were a proud, fearsome people who were fighting for their sacred Paha Sapa the Black Hills against the endless tide of gold seekers and settlers. To them she was an invader, an enemy. She should have turned back. She should have run to her sod house, barred the door, and prayed he didn't have companions. But as she watched, a shudder ran through his body, and a low moan escaped his lips. It wasn't the sound of a warrior. It was the sound of a man in agony. He was young, she realized. Perhaps no older than she was, 24 or 25. The arrow in his back wasn't a soldier's arrow. The fletching was different, cruder, made with grey goose feathers. Sean's voice came to her again, a gentle chiding. "Is it a man who's hurt Maeve? Then you help him. The rest is just noise." She took a deep, steadying breath and stepped out from the cover of the ravine. The snap of a twig under her foot made the man flinch. He tried to push himself up to turn, but the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through him, and he collapsed again with a guttural cry. Slowly her hands held out in front of her, to show she meant no harm. She approached. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, her voice feeling alien in the quiet grove. "You're hurt. I can help." He was still conscious, his dark eyes burning with a mixture of fever pain and fierce, untamed pride. He watched her every move, tensed like a cornered wolf. Maeve knelt beside him, her medical training a patchwork of her father's lessons and frontier necessity taking over. The arrow was deep. The skin around it was swollen and angry. There was blood, but not as much as she would have expected, meaning the shaft had plugged the wound. Breaking it off would be agony, and pulling it through would be worse. It had to come out the way it went in. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I need to get you to the house." His eyes narrowed. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her intent. A low rumble started in his chest. A warning. "Listen to me," she insisted, her voice firm but gentle. "You stay here. You die. The fever will take you, or the wolves will. Or my neighbors will find you and put a bullet in you. Your only chance is with me. Do you understand?" She pointed to herself, then to her house, visible through the trees. "Help." He stared at her for a long moment. He saw not a frightened settler, but a woman with clear, determined blue eyes and a steady hand. He saw the faint outline of the pistol in her apron, yet her hands were open and empty. He was dying. He knew it. The poison from the arrowhead. He suspected it was snake venom. A dirty trick was already making his vision swim. He had nothing left to lose. With a great effort, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Getting him back to the house was a nightmare. He was heavy, all lean muscle and bone, and every step was a torment for him. He leaned on her, his arm draped over her shoulder, his breath coming in ragged, hot gasps against her neck. She could feel the fever radiating from his skin. The 100-yard journey felt like a mile. They stumbled into the cool darkness of the sod house, and he sagged against the wall, leaving a bloody smear on the whitewashed plaster. Maeve barred the door. The sound of the heavy wooden bolt sliding into place felt final, as if she had just locked the world out, or locked a new dangerous world in. The Lakota warrior slid to the floor, his eyes closing for a moment against a wave of dizziness. She looked at him, the sworn enemy of her people lying wounded on her floor. The arrow in his back was a declaration of war. The man it was stuck in was her patient. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. She didn't know it yet, but with that simple act of mercy, Maeve Callahan had just invited the full fury of the Dakota Plains to her doorstep. Night fell like a black shroud, bringing with it a deceptive peace. The only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the low, pained breathing of the man on her floor. Maeve worked by the light of a single tallow candle, its flame dancing and casting long, menacing shadows that writhed on the walls. She had given him water, which he drank greedily, and then she faced the task she dreaded. The arrow. "I need to get this out," she said, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but would grasp the meaning. She gestured to the shaft, then made a pulling motion. His eyes glazed with fever, focused on her. He spoke for the first time, his voice a dry rasp. "Tokaheya, go on." He then gritted his teeth and braced himself against the floor. Maeve's father had taught her that a barbed arrowhead was a devil's invention. You couldn't just pull it back. She needed to push it through. But it was too deep lodged against bone. Her only choice was to pull and hope the barb didn't tear him apart inside. She took a bottle of whiskey from the small cupboard, Sean's last bottle saved for a special occasion that never came. She uncorked it and handed it to the warrior. "Drink," she commanded, making a drinking gesture. He looked at the bottle, then at her, a flicker of something suspicion, surprise in his eyes. He took a long, deep swallow, his throat working. He coughed the raw spirit, shaking his frame, but he took another. Then he handed it back. "Now for the wound," she said, steeling herself. She poured a generous amount of the whiskey over the entry point. The man hissed in pain, his knuckles white where he gripped the floorboards, but he didn't cry out. With a clean rag, she wiped away the blood and grime. She needed a firm grip on the shaft. Taking a deep breath, she placed one hand flat on his back to hold him steady and wrapped her other hand around the arrow shaft. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And then she pulled. It was a sound of tearing of resistance of wet, stubborn flesh, refusing to yield. The warrior arched his back, a strangled scream caught in his throat, his entire body convulsing. For a heart-stopping second, Maeve thought she would fail, that it wouldn't move. She put all her weight and strength into it, her muscles screaming. Then with a sickening pop, the arrowhead came free. He collapsed, panting, sweat pouring from his body. Maeve, shaking and breathing heavily, held the arrow in her hand. It was longer than she'd realized. The head was wickedly barbed, a sliver of dark, chipped flint. The shaft was birch, and the fletching she saw now was bound with sinew and painted with a simple black band. It was not the ornate, eagle-feathered fletching she had seen on the arrows of the Sioux warriors, who sometimes passed peacefully at a great distance. This was different. She set it aside carefully on the table, a piece of evidence in a crime she didn't yet understand. For the next 2 days, Maeve was a prisoner in her own home, her life revolving around the stranger's fever. She forced broth and willow bark tea between his lips. She bathed his burning skin with cool water. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring in his own tongue, words that were sharp and angry, other times soft and mournful. During his lucid moments, he would watch her, his gaze intense, unreadable. They existed in a world without words, communicating through gestures and instinct. She learned the subtle shift in his breathing that meant he needed water. He learned the sound of her footsteps that meant help was coming, not harm. She began to see him not as a faceless warrior, but as a man. She saw the old scars that crisscrossed his arms and chest, telling stories of hunts and battles she could only imagine. She saw a small, faded tattoo of a falcon on his wrist. On the third morning, the fever broke. She awoke to find him sitting up, leaning against the wall, his eyes clear for the first time. The wound on his back was a raw, angry red, but it was clean. He looked weak, but the fire was back in his eyes. He saw her stir and gave a slight nod of his head, a gesture of thanks. Maeve went to the stove and prepared a thin gruel of oats. When she brought it to him, he took the bowl with a steady hand. His name, he told her, was Chaitan, which he conveyed by pointing to himself and saying the name slowly, then touching the falcon tattoo on his wrist. Maeve, in turn, pointed to herself. Maeve. Maeva. He repeated the sound, careful in his mouth. A fragile truce existed in the small cabin, but outside the world was not at peace. Later that afternoon, as Maeve was mending a tear in his leather breeches, an act of domesticity that felt strangely surreal. Chaitan suddenly tensed. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked toward the door. Maeve heard nothing but the wind, but he had heard something else. He struggled to his feet, wincing, and moved to the small window, peering cautiously around the edge of the curtain. His body went rigid. He looked back at her, his eyes wide, with an emotion she couldn't place, not fear, but a grim urgency. He gestured for her to look. Heart pounding, Maeve crept to the window. On the ridge to the north, perhaps a mile away, were 5 riders. They were too far to make out details, but they were not soldiers. They were Indians, sitting on their ponies, silhouetted against the bright sky. They weren't moving. They were watching, surveying the land, surveying her land. A cold dread washed over her. They were looking for him. Chaitan turned from the window, his gaze falling on the arrow she had left on the table. He picked it up, his expression hardening. He held it out to her, shaking his head vehemently. He pointed to his own chest, then made a gesture as if holding a bow, and said one word full of contempt, "Thashunke koki fape." He repeated it, simplifying, pointing out the window again. Crow. Then he pointed to his back where the wound was. Crow, he said again. He then touched his chest once more. Lakota. The implication slammed into Maeve with the force of a physical blow. The arrow in his back was from a Crow warrior, the traditional enemy of the Lakota. The men on the ridge, his own people, were hunting him. But why Chaitan saw the confusion on her face. He struggled for the right gestures, his frustration mounting. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth and on a spare piece of wood drew a stick figure of a man himself. Then he drew several more figures Lakota. He drew them meeting with men in hats, soldiers. He then drew a flurry of arrows coming from a hidden place, striking down the other Lakota figures. He pointed to the figure of himself, then drew him running away. Finally, he looked at Maeve, his eyes pleading for understanding, and drew one of the stick figures, the one who had shot the others, handing a pouch to one of the soldiers. Betrayal. They thought he was the traitor. They believed he had led the soldiers into an ambush of his own people. But he was trying to tell her that he had been framed. The crow arrow in his back was his only proof that someone else was involved, that the attacker wasn't Lakota. Before she could process the full, terrifying meaning of his drawing, a new sound cut through the air. Not the wind, not a distant call, but the unmistakable rhythmic beat of horse hooves approaching the cabin at a steady, deliberate pace, not from the ridge, but from the main trail. The riders on the ridge had been a scouting party. The main group was here. Chayton's face was a mask of grim resolve. He grabbed the Colt from Maeve's waistband, his movements surprisingly fast. He intended to fight. "No," Maeve hissed, snatching it back. "You're too weak. You'd be dead in a second." She shoved the pistol back into her apron, her mind racing. "Hide! In the root cellar." She pointed to the trapdoor hidden under a bearskin rug. There was no time to argue. The hoofbeats were slowing, stopping right outside her door. Chayton gave her one last look, a look that conveyed 1,000 words of warning and reluctant trust, and lowered himself into the dark hole. Maeve quickly threw the rug back over the door, smoothing it with a trembling hand, just as a hard, authoritative knock echoed through the cabin. The knock was loud and commanding. It was not a request for entry. It was a demand. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from her palms, and walked to the door. She looked through the peephole Sean had drilled in the thick wood. Her blood ran cold. Standing on her porch was a Lakota warrior. He was older than Chayton, his face a road map of hard-won battles and deep-set authority. His hair was streaked with grey, and an eagle feather was tied into one of his braids. But it was his face that held her. It was painted, black and red, the colors of war. He was not alone. Behind him, she could see others, their faces grim, their hands resting on rifles and bows. Dawn had come, and war paint was at her door. The heavy oak bar across the door felt like the only thing separating her world from complete annihilation. The warrior knocked again, louder this time, the sound vibrating through the very floorboards beneath which Chayton was hiding. Maeve's mind was a maelstrom of terror and calculation. To refuse to open was an admission of guilt. To open was to face a man whose eyes already held a verdict. She drew in a breath that felt like shattered glass and pulled the bar. The door swung inward with a low groan. The warrior stood framed in the doorway, a figure of absolute, uncompromising authority. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the sunlight catching the intricate beadwork on his vest. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over her, then past her, scanning every corner of the small cabin. He was looking for something, or someone. "You are alone?" he asked. His English was heavily accented, but clear and direct. Maeve's heart leaped into her throat. She forced it down, meeting his gaze with a composure she did not feel. "I am she," said her voice, a little too high, a little too thin. She cleared her throat. "I am always alone." The warrior's gaze was unsettling. It felt as if he could see the lie taking shape in her mind. "We follow the trail of a man," he said, his voice low and rumbling. "A traitor. He carries a wound, an arrow in the back. The trail ends near this place. There is no one here." Maeve repeated, stepping aside slightly to give him a better view of the empty room. It was a calculated risk, a show of having nothing to hide. "I have seen no one, only the prairie and the wind." The warrior, who she would later learn was the formidable war chief Wanbli-Gleska, or Spotted Eagle, did not move. His eyes lingered on the scrubbed wooden table, the pot of day-old broth on the cold stove, the bearskin rug on the floor. Every mundane object seemed to scream her secret. Was there a drop of blood she had missed? A scuff mark on the floor? A woman living alone this far from the fort is either very brave or very foolish. Wanbli-Gleska observed his tone flat. "My husband built this house," Maeve replied, finding a sliver of strength in the memory of Sean. "My place is here. I am neither brave nor foolish. I am stubborn." One of the younger warriors behind him shifted impatiently, murmuring something in Lakota. Wanbli-Gleska held up a hand, silencing him without looking. His focus was entirely on Maeve. He took a single step into the cabin, his presence seeming to suck all the air from the room. He sniffed the air like a predator tasting a scent. Whiskey. Willow bark. The faint metallic tang of blood she had tried so hard to scrub away. His eyes narrowed. There is the smell of sickness in this house. Of medicine. I have been unwell, Maeve stammered, cursing herself for the slip. A summer fever. Wanbli-Gleska's gaze dropped to her hands. They were chapped and calloused from work, but they weren't the hands of a woman battling a fever. They were the hands of a woman who had been working tirelessly. His eyes then moved to the corner where she kept her washing supplies. He saw the basin, and next to it a small pile of rags. One of them at the bottom bore a faint, dark, reddish-brown stain. He said nothing. He simply looked from the rag to her face. In that silent moment, a battle of wills was waged. Maeve felt her facade cracking, the terror threatening to break through. She thought of Chaitan, in the darkness below, wounded, depending on her. She thought of the promise she had made to her own conscience. She lifted her chin, her blue eyes meeting his dark ones. "If you mean to harm me, do it," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a defiant calm. "But I will not be frightened from my own home. I have told you. I am alone." For a long, breathless eternity, Wanbli-Gleska stared at her. He seemed to be weighing her soul. He was a man accustomed to reading signs, the track of a deer, the turn of the weather, the lie in a man's eyes. He saw the fear in hers, but beneath it he saw a spine of iron. Perhaps she was telling the truth, or perhaps she was a better liar than any man he had ever met. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He turned and walked out of the cabin, the sunlight glinting off the rifle he carried. His warriors, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and confusion, followed him. Maeve stood frozen, listening as they mounted their horses. Wanbli-Gleska's voice cut through the air one last time. "The spirits of the Pahasapa see all things. They see truth, and they see deception. We will be watching." The sound of their horses faded into the distance. Maeve stumbled back and slammed the door, ramming the bar home. Her legs gave way, and she slid to the floor, her body racked with tremors. She had survived, for now. But his last words echoed in her mind. "We will be watching." It was not an idle threat. After what felt like a lifetime, she crawled to the rug and pulled it back, her fingers fumbling with the handle of the trap door. She lifted it. Chaitan looked up his face, a grim, shadowy mask in the darkness. He had heard everything. He climbed out his movements, stiff. He went to the window and looked out at the empty prairie. When he turned back to her, the gratitude in his eyes was profound. but it was overshadowed by a new shared urgency. Hiding was no longer an option. Juan Bligleska was suspicious. He would be back. They were living on borrowed time. The confrontation with Juan Bligleska shattered the fragile peace of the cabin, replacing it with a humming, palpable tension. They were no longer just a nurse and a patient. They were allies in a conspiracy trapped behind enemy lines with enemies on all sides. The promise to be watching hung over the homestead like a hawk circling its prey. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Maeve. Over the next few days, as Chaitan regained his strength, the story tumbled out of him, a patchwork of Lakota words, broken English learned from traders, and the universal language of sign and gesture. Maeve listened, her brow furrowed in concentration, piecing together a puzzle of greed and betrayal that was far more complex than she could have imagined. The man they hunted him for being a traitor was another warrior from their band named Tokala, the Fox. Chaitan spoke the name with a venom that needed no translation. Tokala was ambitious, resentful of the respect Chaitan commanded as a skilled hunter and strategist. But this was more than simple jealousy. Chaitan explained that a secret council was to have taken place. It wasn't an army ambush, as his charcoal drawing had crudely depicted. It was a peace delegation. A small group of Lakota elders, led by Chaitan's own uncle, were to meet with a trusted army officer, a Major Clayton Finch, a man known for his fair dealings. The meeting was intended to establish a protected zone for their winter camp, away from the gold rush trails, in exchange for information about renegade bands that were attacking both settlers and Lakota. It was a fragile, unsanctioned hope for peace in a time of war. Only 4 people from their band knew the precise location of the meeting: Chaitan, his uncle, and 2 other elders, and Tokala, who had overheard the plans. Tokala, Chaitan explained with gestures of a hand accepting gold, had made his own deal. Not with Major Finch, but with a white man Chaitan knew only by the name the traders used for him, he who sells rusting guns. A man who profited from conflict, a man who supplied faulty rifles to the army and illegal whiskey to the tribes, a man who wanted the war to continue because peace was bad for business. Maeve, from her trips to the trading post near Deadwood, knew who he meant. A smug, corpulent man named Josiah Reed, a freight contractor who always seemed to be at the center of shady land deals and supply swindles. On the day of the planned meeting, Tokala didn't show. Instead, a war party of Crow, their sworn enemies, descended on the meeting place. It was a massacre. Chaitan's uncle and the elders were killed. Major Finch, arriving late, found the carnage, and only one survivor, Chaitan, who had been shot in the back with a crow arrow as he fought his way out. The real genius of Tokala's plan, Chaitan conveyed with bitter irony, was how he had reported the incident back to the Lakota war camp. He claimed the meeting was a trap all along, orchestrated by Chaitan himself. He claimed Chaitan had sold them out to the army for gold. As proof, Tokala had produced a small bag of gold coins he found in Chaitan's abandoned teepee. The final damning piece of evidence was that Chaitan had escaped. In the harsh code of the warrior, the lone survivor of a disaster is often viewed with suspicion. Juan Bligleska, whose own cousin was one of the slain elders, was consumed by grief and rage. He had taken Tokala at his word. He had painted his face for vengeance and set out to hunt the man he believed was responsible for the betrayal Chaitan. The crow arrow was Chaitan's only proof of innocence. The Lakota would never have used an enemy's arrow to stage an ambush. It was a sign of a third party. It was the key. Maeve sat at her table, the arrow lying in front of her. It was no longer just a piece of wood and flint. It was Chaitan's life. It was the truth. She looked from the arrow to the man who now sat before her, his face etched with pain and a desperate, burning need for justice. She saw the falcon tattoo on his wrist and understood his name wasn't just a name. It was a symbol of his spirit, proud, free, and now what? Josiah Reed, she said aloud, the name feeling like poison on her tongue. He's based out of the supply depot near Fort Meade. She knew of him. A man widely disliked but grudgingly tolerated because he controlled the flow of goods. He was untouchable. The scale of the danger suddenly expanded. This wasn't just about hiding from one Gleska anymore. If Josiah Reed and the treacherous Tokala knew that Chaitin had survived and was with her, they would not hesitate to silence them both. A lone woman on an isolated homestead would be an easy target. Her death would be blamed on Indians, fueling the very fires Reed wanted to keep burning. "They cannot know you are here," Maeve said, her voice barely a whisper. "No one can." Chaitin nodded, his expression grim. He understood perfectly. They were trapped between two hunting parties, one seeking vengeance for a crime he didn't commit, and one seeking to bury the truth of a crime he had witnessed. That evening, Maeve did something she hadn't done since Sean died. She took out his old leather-bound journal. She didn't write in it. She just held it, trying to draw strength from the memory of his steadfast courage. She had taken a wounded man into her home out of mercy. Now she was harboring a fugitive, a witness to a conspiracy that could plunge the entire territory into a new bloody war. The simple act of kindness had become an act of rebellion. She looked over at Chaitin, who was staring into the dying embers of the fire, his face a study in silent anguish. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this could not end in her quiet sod house. Sooner or later, the violence of the world outside would come crashing through her door. They had to do something. They had to get the truth out. But how? And to whom? The waiting became a special kind of torture. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. Maeve created a routine of mundane normalcy, a flimsy shield against the ever-present threat. She tended her garden, milked the cow, and mended clothes, all while her ears were strained for the sound of hoof-beats and her eyes constantly scanned the horizon. Chaitin remained hidden in the cellar during the day, emerging only at night to pace the confines of the small cabin like a caged animal. His wound was healing the flesh, knitting itself back together, but his spirit was frayed. They knew they couldn't hide forever. Gleska's warriors were out there watching. And somewhere near Deadwood, Josiah Reed and Tokala were likely wondering why the hunt for Chaitin had gone cold. "We need a plan," Maeve said one evening, breaking the tense silence. "We can't just wait for them to find us." Chaitin stopped his pacing. Gleska," he said, his voice firm. "He must see. The arrow." He pointed to the crow arrow still resting on the mantelpiece. "See it. He was in this room and didn't see it." Maeve countered, her frustration boiling over. "He has already judged you. He will not listen to a white woman defending a man he thinks is a traitor." "Not him," Chaitin clarified. His brow furrowed as he searched for the words. He made a gesture of many people sitting in a circle. "The council, the elders, they are wise. They listen to the spirits, not just to anger. Gleska's heart is hot with grief. Their hearts are cool." The plan was insane. He wanted to go to the main Lakota winter camp deep in the sacred Black Hills, find the Council of Elders, and present his case. It was a journey of at least 3 days on foot through hostile territory, rumfalling with prospectors, soldiers, and worst of all, one Gleska's own warriors. And he was still not at full strength. "You'll never make it," Maeve said flatly. "You're too weak. They'll catch you before you've gone 10 miles. A grim resolve settled on his face. "I will die a warrior, not a rat in a hole." An idea desperate and terrifying began to form in Maeve's mind. An idea so reckless it made her feel dizzy. "You won't go on foot," she said, thinking aloud. "And you won't go alone." Before Chayton could question her, the sound they had been dreading finally came, a lone rider approaching. Not Lakota this time. Maeve peered through the peephole, and her stomach clenched. It was Sheriff Brody from the small settlement of Rock Creek, a man whose face was a permanent roadmap of weariness. "Hide!" she hissed at Chayton, who slipped back into the cellar without a sound. Maeve opened the door. Sheriff Brody, a lanky man with a drooping mustache, tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Mrs. Callahan. Just doing my rounds. Heard some troubling reports." "Oh," Maeve asked, leaning against the doorframe, trying to appear casual. "Some of Spotted Eagle's boys been seen nosing around this area, causing a bit of a stir down at the Petersons' place. You seen anything?" His eyes were kind, but they missed nothing. "The wind and the sun, Sheriff. Same as always." She lied. Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Listen, Maeve. I've known you since you and Sean first staked this claim. You're a good woman, but you're isolated out here. Tensions are higher than a cat's back in a dog kennel. If you see anything at all, you fire 2 shots in the air, you hear I'll get a posse together." "I can take care of myself, Sheriff," she said, patting the Colt that was once again tucked in her apron. Brody's eyes lingered on her for a moment. "I know you can. But that won't stop a war party. Just be careful." He glanced around the homestead, his gaze lingering on the ground near the barn. "Mule looks like he threw a shoe." Maeve's heart skipped a beat. She followed his gaze. There were tracks in the soft dirt near the barn. 2 sets of tracks, hers and a set made by a man walking with a limp. The tracks Chayton had made when they first stumbled from the creek. She had been so consumed with the terror inside the house, she hadn't thought to cover the evidence outside. Brody looked from the tracks back to her face. He didn't say another word about it. He just tipped his hat again. "You take care now, Maeve." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unspoken suspicion in his wake. The moment he was gone, Maeve's desperate idea solidified into a concrete plan. Brody's visit was a final warning. The walls were closing in. That night, she laid it out for Chayton. "I'll take you," she said. "Not all the way to your camp, but close. We'll use the wagon and Jedediah. We'll hide you under canvas and supplies. We'll travel at night. It's our only chance." Chayton protested. It was too dangerous for her. If they were caught, the soldiers would see her as a collaborator, an Indian lover. Her life would be forfeit. "My life is already forfeit if I stay here," Maeve argued, her voice fierce. "Josiah Reed will not leave a witness alive, and one Gleska will eventually find you. My choice is to die waiting or die trying. I choose trying." She held up the crow arrow. "And this is coming with us." 2 nights later, under the sliver of a crescent moon, they set out. The small farm wagon was loaded with canvas-empty barrels and a few sacks of grain to make it look like a legitimate trip to a far-off grist mill. Hidden in a cleverly constructed hollow space beneath it all lay Chayton the crow arrow, wrapped in cloth and tucked inside his tunic. Maeve sat on the driver's bench, the reins in one hand, the colt peacemaker resting on her lap. Jedediah the mule pulled stubbornly, his hoofbeats muffled by the soft dirt of the open plains. They were heading west towards the dark, jagged silhouette of the Paha Sapa. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every coyote's call sounded like a warning. Maeve Callahan, the widow homesteader, was driving her wagon straight into the heart of the conflict on a ride to what could very well be her damnation. But it was also a ride toward the slim, flickering hope of justice. The journey was a descent into a waking nightmare. They traveled by the cold light of the moon and stars hiding during the day in secluded ravines or thick stands of pine. The silence of the plains was immense, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the wind's mournful song. Twice they saw the distant campfires of what could have been prospectors or cavalry patrols and made wide, nerve-wracking detours. Once a Lakota scout on a pinto pony watched them from a butte for a full hour before melting back into the landscape, leaving them to wonder if they had been identified. Chayton, cramped and restless in his hiding spot, was a silent partner in the ordeal. Maeve could feel his presence beneath her feet, a concentration of dangerous energy. At night, when they stopped, he would emerge, stretching his stiff limbs, his eyes scanning the darkness with an acuity that amazed her. He taught her to read the stars to find their way by the position of Wichhapi Owangjila, the star that does not move. He was a warrior, and this was his land. She was the outsider, but she was the key to his passage. On the third night, they reached the foothills of the Black Hills. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. According to Chayton, the main winter camp was another day's journey ahead, nestled in a hidden valley known as the Valley of Whispering Waters. His plan was to leave her here and proceed on foot. They had stopped in a small clearing to let the mule rest when the world exploded. A rifle shot cracked through the night, splintering the wooden side of the wagon just inches from Maeve's head. Jedediah brayed in terror. Before Maeve could even grab her colt figures, emerged from the moon shadows of the pines. It wasn't one Blee Gleska's warriors. It was 3 white men, their faces hard and cruel in the dim light rifles leveled. And leading them, a smirking, triumphant figure in buckskins, was the Lakota traitor Tokala. The little bird has flown far from her nest, a voice drawled. Josiah Reed stepped out from behind a ponderosa pine, a Spencer rifle held casually in the crook of his arm. He was larger and more imposing than Maeve remembered, his eyes glinting with avarice. Chayton erupted from the back of the wagon, no longer a hidden passenger, but a primal force of fury. He had a knife in his hand, a blade Maeve hadn't even known he possessed. But he was one man against 5, one with a knife against rifles. "I wouldn't," Reed said calmly, gesturing with his rifle barrel. "We've been tracking you since you left that little sod house. Your friendly Sheriff Brody isn't as tight-lipped as you might think." For a few dollars, he was happy to mention his suspicions. The betrayal stung Maeve more than the initial gunshot. Brody, the tired, weary face of the law, was just another man with a price. "Tokala here," Reed continued, "was smart enough to realize that if the great Chayton didn't turn up dead, he might eventually turn up to talk. We couldn't have that. And you, my dear," he said, his eyes crawling over Maeve, "are the loose end, a real shame." Tokala stepped forward, speaking to Chayton in a torrent of angry Lakota. Chayton spat a single word in response. The hatred between them was a living thing. He wants the arrow. Reed translated a cruel smile playing on his lips. The proof. He says to give it to him, and he will kill the woman quickly. Go to hell. Maeve breathed her hand slowly, inch by inch, moving toward the colt on the seat beside her. Chayton saw her movement. He knew what was coming. He took a half step to his left, drawing the attention of the men. It was all the distraction she needed. Maeve grabbed the colt, rolled off the wagon seat, and fired. Her shot went wide, but it served its purpose. Chaos erupted. Reed's men opened fire, their bullets thudding into the wagon. Chayton lunged not at Reed, but at Tokal, Kala the source of his dishonor. The two Lakota warriors crashed to the ground in a desperate tangle of limbs, a battle of knife and raw strength. Maeve, using the wagon for cover, fired again, this time aiming more carefully. One of Reed's hired guns cried out and clutched his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. She was a homesteader, not a gunfighter, but Sean had taught her to shoot straight. Suddenly, a new sound joined the fray. A war cry. Not from Tokala, but from the trees behind Reed. A group of riders burst into the clearing, their faces painted not for vengeance, but for battle. Leading them, his face a mask of stone, was one Bligleska. He had been watching. He had followed them. Reed spun around, his face pale with shock. He had walked into a trap of his own making. One Bligleska's warriors descended on Reed's men with a silent, deadly efficiency. The short, brutal fight was over in moments. Only Reed, Tokala, Chayton, and Maeve were left in the center of the clearing, surrounded by a ring of grim-faced Lakota. Tokala and Chayton were still locked in their struggle, rolling on the ground. Reed, ever the opportunist, raised his hands in surrender. "Chief Spotted Eagle," Reed said, his voice slick with false sincerity. "A misunderstanding. This man Chayton is a traitor. We were helping you bring him to justice." One Bligleska ignored him. His eyes were fixed on the two struggling warriors. With a roar, Chayton finally gained the upper hand, pinning Tokala to the ground, his knife at the traitor's throat. "Wait!" Maeve cried out, scrambling from behind the wagon. All eyes turned to her. She held up the object that had started it all, the crow arrow. She walked forward, her heart hammering, and held it out to one Bligleska. "This was in his back," she said, her voice ringing with clarity in the sudden silence. "This is a crow arrow, not Lakota, not soldier. Ask him." She pointed a shaking finger at the terrified Josiah Reed. "Why his man Tokala met with the crow before the ambush." One Bligleska took the arrow. He studied the fletching, the black band, the chipped flint head. He had seen arrows like this before on the bodies of his own people after skirmishes with their hated enemy. He looked at Tokala pinned under Chayton, his face a mask of guilt. He looked at Josiah Reed, whose blustering confidence had finally evaporated, replaced by raw fear. And he looked at Chayton, whose eyes burned with the fire of vindicated honor. The truth, stark and undeniable, settled in the clearing. One Bligleska handed the arrow back to one of his warriors and walked over to Chayton and Tokala. He said nothing. He simply nudged Chayton with his foot, a silent command to step aside. Chayton, breathing heavily, rose and moved away from the whimpering traitor. One Bligleska looked down at Tokala, his face devoid of all emotion. Then he drew his own knife. Justice on the plains was swift and without appeal. When it was done, one Bligleska turned his cold gaze on Josiah Reed. "You sell rusting guns," he said, using the trader's name, "and you buy lies." He gestured to two of his warriors. He is yours. Reed's fate would be a slow one. The chief finally turned to Chaitan. He walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. Words were spoken in Lakota. Words of apology, of restoration of honor regained. Chaitan stood tall, no longer a fugitive, but a warrior of his people once more. His eyes found Maeve's across the clearing. In that one look, a world of gratitude passed between them. He had his life and his name back. And she, in the heart of the violence she had so feared, had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The war was over, at least for tonight. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale grey light over the scene. Maeve stood by her wagon, a lone white woman, in a circle of Lakota warriors, the smell of pine and gunpowder in the air. She had found a warrior with an arrow in his back, and now, after a dawn of reckoning, she was finally truly alone again. But the silence that would greet her on the long ride home would be different. It would no longer be the silence of loss, but the quiet of survival. The story of Maeve Callahan and the warrior Chaitan isn't written in any official history book. You won't find their names in the records of Fort Meade or the treaties signed in Washington. Theirs is a story written on the land itself, whispered by the Dakota wind. It's a testament to the fact that the Old West wasn't just about famous outlaws and legendary lawmen. It was built on the quiet, desperate choices of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. People for whom right and wrong were not simple matters of black and white, but shades of grey, painted against a landscape of survival. Maeve returned to her homestead, forever changed. Chaitan returned to his people, his honor restored. They were two people from different worlds, brought together by violence, bound for a moment by courage. If this story of bravery, betrayal, and the complex heart of the American West moved you, please help us keep these true histories alive. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the frontier. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And please leave a comment below. What part of Maeve's choice resonated with you the most? We read every one. Thank you for listening.